Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. Remember to subscribe to our free podcast so you won't miss any of our illuminating content. Here is episode 178.
Being humble as an individual yourself can help you see your kids in a way that like you're not trying to get them to be all the things that you're not able to be.
Benjamin Franklin once said, "Do not curse the darkness, rather light a candle instead." If you're ready to set your mind on fire, then prepare yourself for the Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
Today's fire starter is Tomis Parker. Tomis has been facilitating in self-directed education environments since 2009. He helped birth the first Agile Learning Center in New York City and served as the director for 3 years. Now he lives in Charlotte, North Carolina, where he works and plays at ALC Mosaic. He wants to help organize a cohesive movement for self-directed education because he believes that trusting children is the most powerful catalyst for social change. Welcome, Tomis.
Hi, Rebecca. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm super excited to learn more about your learning centers and how you're helping with this movement of self-directed learning. But before we get into any of that, can you please tell our audience a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. My name's Tomis. I'm 30-year-old male. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina with my wife, Nancy Tilton. We are directors of a self-directed learning community school here called ALC Mosaic that serves kids as young as 2 or 3 up to 14 right now. I've been playing in this self-directed education world for a little while now, and is what I spend a majority of my time doing in terms of either growing the community here in Charlotte that I'm a part of now where I live, and also larger kind of digital communities across larger physical space online through the Agile Learning Center's network and through the Alliance for Self-Directed Education.
That's awesome. Well, and do you kind of want to give us what your journey looked like that led you to this type of work that you're doing now?
Well, it depends, I guess, how far back you want to go. But to try to summarize, I had some experiences as a very young person of doing a tiny bit of homeschooling and then just having some experiences in public school that, kind of planted some seeds of inquiry for me. And then those kinds of things were latent for most of my childhood and until around the time, really the end of college. I was getting a degree in psychology and pretty much already realized that really wasn't going to mean anything once I graduated, and was also pretty entrepreneurially minded as a young person and as a young adult. I really valued independence and my autonomy. So I think that was a big component. And I was really just kind of doing a lot of my own learning and self-discovery in college outside of what I was supposed to be learning. And was really looking for the kind of work to do that felt like really deeply meaningful to me, like it was actually creating change on a root level. And was, at a time in my life where there's some despair I was feeling around entering the world as it was and trying to what would the version of myself look like that was getting a job that I didn't really care about? And would I actually be able to handle that kind of a natural schism of being different people that didn't really feel authentic to me? I was really wanting to figure that out. And, for a lot of people that do this work, it's been a common catalyst, but I basically stumbled upon the book Summerhill in college. That just kind of set a bunch of light bulbs off for me and kind of went on a tirade of exploring these ideas of self-directed education, democratic education, kind of alternative parenting styles and philosophies. And that just really made so much sense to me in terms of trying to address all of the things that didn't make sense to me about the world. To speed things up, I kind of passionately got myself involved. I wanted to move to New York City and change kind of like my experience of the world drastically by being there, and got myself involved in a free school startup that was happening there in Manhattan, and worked with that school for 4 years and learned a ton. And then that experience kind of, in a very short, brief way, just describe it, kind of folded into a new opportunity with some really great people to build this thing called Agile Learning Centers that was really informed by lots of people's experiences. For me, it was informed by just all that I learned with the free school along the way, and what I was kind of seeing happening in the alternative education space, and how that was not quite connecting in certain ways. So I've been doing that ever since. I was the director of the ALC in Manhattan for 3 years, and then I met my wife through that work, and I live in Charlotte now and run ALC Mosaic with her, which is the school that she started around the same time I was starting to direct the ALC in New York.
So were you going into teaching, or was this kind of just something that all of a sudden just lit a light bulb for you, where you're like, oh my gosh, this totally makes sense?
Yeah, no, definitely not going into teaching. Was the opposite of going into teaching. I definitely felt education was kind of the social engineering of the wrong kind, and so was really not attracted to that. And so then became really attracted to the idea of kind of undoing all of that negative social engineering by doing education a different way. So really, it's more about a philosophy of like humans and social change for me, that just kind of uses education kind of as the Trojan horse in a sense, because that's the world we live in, where like school and education are unfortunately synonymous for people. And so it's kind of like getting into that world in order to undo some of what's been done there. So I was not interested in being a teacher myself, but work with some great people, including my wife, who were teachers and kind of had a different backdoor entry or a different kind of path to the same general place. That was actually one of the things that I realized in my first working with the first school I worked with, was the roles were really ambiguous at that time with that school. And I kind of learned for myself that my impact to make in this work probably had less to do with the like teaching direct, working with kids all the time thing, and more in the entrepreneurial kind of like bigger picture visioning, working with adults kind of space too. So
yeah, well, and that's kind of what I love about the learning centers, the self-directed learning centers, is that, I think it's even a discovery for the adults that are involved. It's definitely a discovery for the kids, but it's a discovery for you as well, and your own learning and growth too. What are some of the inspirations behind, you mentioned the book, was it Summerhill that you read? Mm-hmm. What were maybe some of the inspirations that you felt from that you felt like all of a sudden like, wow, this is my mission and my passion? Can you summarize that? Or?
Yeah, I guess essentially it kind of boils down to what I've learned to kind of articulate over the years as a different perspective on children, and thus on like the way we view the world. It's almost like the biggest lesson we teach kids in traditional schools and in traditional kind of parenting worldviews is that like the world is this thing that's waiting for them, and that it works a certain way, and that unfortunately it's pretty messed up in a lot of ways, but that's just the way it works, and that's just kind of how it goes. And so your job as a kid, through your relationship with your parents and through your schooling, is to kind of like twist and mold and contort yourself into all kinds of uncomfortable, strange shapes and ways to fit into the world as it exists. And, for me, it was like all these things that just seemed like adults knew were madness and didn't make sense and were crazy or were illogical things to be doing are just, it's just kind of part of the way it works. And you're just supposed to accept that and do that and fit into the world. And so for me, the light bulb was kind of like, what does education look like? What does life look like if we are telling ourselves and telling our kids that like it hasn't actually happened yet, but that we are creating it moment by moment, and that we're responsible for our reality and for what's going on. And like the goal isn't to become complicit with what's going on in the world. The goal is to be an active creator of it. And if you have that perspective, then you really can't engage in a type of educational approach that is about dictating to kids what they shouldn't be doing, what they shouldn't be thinking, what the right answer is or is not. It just completely turns that process on its head.
Yeah.
And so that's really the place in which I operate from, and that all the kind of like ideas about quote unquote education, are coming from that place.
That's awesome. Well, do you want to tell me some challenges that you've had along the way and maybe what you've learned from those challenges, to come into this new thing where, it's turned on its head and all of a sudden you're having to really think about things differently? Yeah.
I think the biggest challenges when I first started getting into the work, the biggest challenges is that generally nobody knows what they're doing in this space because it's new. It's really new. It's really ancient, but for us, it's really new because we've been, for many generations now conditioned into thinking a much different way about kids and school and education. So I think the biggest thing is the biggest challenge on an ongoing basis is for myself, for the people I work with, for the parents in our community, and then for the, larger world that might be interacting with us is undoing these kinds of programmed ways of thinking about how learning should take place, how child development takes place, how adults should be living our lives. I mean, I think it goes into another challenge is that when you remove, a fixed predicted curriculum, when you take away this idea that these are the things that kids should be learning and the goal is to get them all to do these things at some mediocre level of, success. When you take that away, then there's kind of a void left. And it's well, what are you going to fill that void with? So what are we doing? So the biggest learning for me has been about over the past 6 years or so has been learning that lesson that now there's that. It's not just you put, I was kind of romantic about after reading, Summerhill and reading a bunch of other literature, going to New York and, there's 30 kids in a room and tell them that they're free and then magic happens and there's, unicorns and rainbows and everyone's hugging and everyone is connected. And, it's that's not the case. We're still humans that bring all kinds of stuff into that space. So a lot of the learning is about how to create something intentional and positive and actually then do the work of, okay, so the shackles have been removed. Now what do you want instead?
What are you going to do with your time type of thing? So that's awesome. Yeah. Well, tell me, how do you feel like your paradigm changed through this over time and with experience? I mean, we've kind of talked about that, but can you pinpoint it to maybe the one lesson that you've got from it?
Well, I think a lot of what I've said around the perspective of how the world viewing the world is a big part of that. I guess the biggest thing is just, kind of continuing off what I was just saying a minute ago is this, if you're responsible for creating what you want, then when these constraints are removed, that's a game that doesn't really switch off. And so, that means for myself, constantly examining what is going on in my life and my relationships and my work, that if I don't like it or whatever I don't like seeing what my responsibility is in that and just kind of seeing the world around me as a result of my choices rather than it's something that's happening to me. That's the kind of paradigm that I'm trying to live in as an individual and that I'm trying to create for children. That can be really frustrating and challenging when to kind of have that juxtaposed to all the what seems like just insanity being looped over and over in front of us in the larger society.
I think what I'm getting from this is you're always having to check yourself to make sure you're not falling back into old patterns of, that we want to be striving forward in a positive way. And I would think it'd be hard. I mean, to be in a learning center, you're not only having to change your paradigm or your thoughts around it, is that you have parents that are coming in, that they want this for their kids, but they're having to, they're falling back into old patterns, and maybe some of the staff members and stuff. It's definitely if we want to strive forward, it's hard to change that.
Yeah, totally. I think, I mean, that's another one of the huge lessons we've learned over the years doing this work is I also kind of thought that this whole thing, similar to how when you put 30 kids in a room and tell them you're free, it doesn't just magically become amazing. The same thing is true in that this, I used to initially thought this concept of trusting kids essentially can work for everyone. And I think that it can work for everyone if once, quote, everyone is actually ready and interested in trusting kids. But it's you can't just say, oh yeah, I want self-directed education for myself or for my kids and my family without actually doing the work to orient yourself, your quote paradigm to that. So that we've learned really when you first are starting a community like this and you need students and families to exist, it can be really, really challenging. But I consult with a bunch of ALC startups about this kind of very thing. And it's so much more valuable to be really clear with parents up front about what you're doing and not try to kind of sell them on it looking a certain way for them and for their kids, because what you really are offering them is like to go on this journey of trusting their kids and it's not going to look the way they imagine. Like at our school here in Charlotte, we have this meeting we do at most ALCs have this light structure on a Monday where we kind of plan out the week and plan activities or offerings is what we call them, that are, kind of group or community wide offerings that take some pre-planning. And, we'll have parents come and visit and observe that meeting. And, by the end of the meeting, or you see this schedule board, and, an educator or a parent might be really, really excited by all the wide range of offerings and opportunities there are at the school in terms of the different subject matters they might touch or the different, learning styles they might, branch out to, and just a wide range of things that happen if you are a progressive, educated kind of person or minded person. But I really stress to parents after that is don't let that make you think your kid's going, oh, this is what my kid's going to be doing all the time, because these are offerings that have kind of come about over time that, some of the kids in the school are participating in, not all of them. And a lot of times parents will see that and be like, oh, this is great. I imagine when I send little Susie here, she'll choose to go on the hike on Thursday, and she'll choose to go to math club, and she'll choose to do writer's workshop, and she'll choose to, do all these things that sound so great. But this is Susie's first time with this type of freedom. And she really just wants to cruise through some YouTube videos that are really interesting, and then run around outside with her friend. And create their own games together, which is all stuff that we value just as much as those offerings. But a parent is going to really, who's not really used to this, can really struggle with that. So
yeah. I love that you point that out, that, when we do self-directed learning, that we can't think it's going to look a certain way. I mean, I've even seen that just with, different people that I know. It's like, oh, my child is going to turn out this way, but it's really different. That's what's awesome about it, is that it's a unique, it has its own uniqueness about it, but it doesn't necessarily mean, they're going to be a brain surgeon or, like you said, right. I mean, they'll pick different paths that maybe you don't realize. That's awesome.
Yeah. And I think that's a big part of the whole, in terms of the word paradigm, a big difference between self-directed education and other forms of progressive education that try to get close to it by incorporating some of the same ideas. But the real shift is are you seeing, do you have this kind of subconscious expectation or desire for your child to turn out a certain way or choose certain things, or, for their life and education to look a certain way? Or do you see them as this amazing mystery that's unfolding in front of you over and over again? Yeah. You know what I mean? And that those are just those are two very different ways of viewing it, and it changes how you go about the whole thing so profoundly.
Yeah. Well, and it really comes down to, are you going to love your child no matter who they become, no matter who they are? And that's really a difficult thing in our society anymore. We place a lot on academics and, I mean, I don't know, but all of those achievements and stuff. But let's talk maybe a little bit about what your self-directed learning centers look like.
That topic's interesting to me.
Sure, go ahead.
I just have a thought on that I think is really, because the way you're saying that, and I think it's in terms of the difference I was saying around whether you're viewing your kid as someone you want, kind of expectations you have or things you want to see, and then the way you put it, loving them no matter who they become. And I think that that's where the again, to use the word paradigm, the perspective that you have is so profound, because if it can feel really hard to love your kid no matter who they become if you don't really fully have that perspective of like they're this like miracle that's unfolding kind of thing in front of me. You know what I mean? It's like it creates that kind of friction where it's like, okay, well, this isn't how I imagined it or how I really want it, but I'm going to learn to love them anyway. You know what I mean? It almost becomes like this like challenge where there's friction. And I'm not saying that this is a paradigm or a perspective that I'm so firmly rooted in. I don't have my own kids yet either, so I'll eat my words, I'm sure. But I think that it really illuminates for me in these contexts with kids too. Like, is that is the friction you're feeling because of expectations that you actually just don't need to have, you know?
Yeah. Well, and the friction's part of it. I mean, and that's, I guess, for parents or for teachers, you know, like you said, you were expecting like rainbows and unicorns and stuff, but sometimes working through just the frictions of the relationship can actually, I may hear people all the time, oh, I couldn't spend that much time with my kids because we would kill each other, you know, if they were home or whatever. But really, that's part of it. I learn a lot. I learn just as much as they do in regards to, you know, letting that friction play out. You know what I mean? Like letting, you know, exploring it, I guess.
Learning. Yeah. It's an opportunity. Absolutely. Something we write about a good bit is like the importance of relationships in this work and viewing conflict as opportunities rather than problems. And that friction becomes the teacher in that situation. And in that case, it might fit the meme that you mentioned that a little better, maybe.
I was telling him about a meme that I saw that I thought we could talk about, but it's basically, you know, the definition of a teacher is a person who helps you solve problems that you'd never have without them. And we were trying to talk about how sometimes when that happens, anyway, tell me your thoughts on that.
Well, I was just thinking about it in terms of, I think it's a great concept or quote, making a valid point. I think the point it's making is about the kind of social construct that exists inside of the teacher relationship, where there's like, it's pointing to the kind of inherent structure of authority or imposition that exists when you have a teacher. And so it's helping you solve a problem that wasn't there before, because if that social construct wasn't there, then you wouldn't have that problem anyway. But in terms of conflict being a teacher, it's an interesting thought to apply the same quote in that regard. So
well, and if we could change it around where, you know, a person who's helping the child solve problems or, you know, whatever, that might be more of like a self-directed learning thing. But I'm like we were talking about that this definitely has more of an authoritarian, you know, bent to it of like, I'm going to give you problems, you know, type of thing. And it really, that meme really comes down to, you know, it's a lot of what I hear from different people about self-directed education. It's like, well, if I don't give them something to do, all they're going to want to do is play video games, or like you talked about, the girl who wants to just watch YouTube videos and play outside with her friends. A lot of people don't see like the learning, you know, happening in those type of situations. You know, we're skipping some of, you know, what your learning centers look like, but you know, do you want to talk about that a little of, how do you find value in that learning?
It's not really my job to find value in that learning. I think that's the other part of it, is like what I want to do with my time and what I find interesting and valuable, you know, changes on a fairly regular basis. Definitely on like over the course of my life, it kind of comes in waves or seasons or groups of years or something like that. So it changes for me. So, and then from individual to individual, it's like the idea that I'm not going to be interested in everything that all the kids in my school are interested in, and I shouldn't have to be. So I think it's like what it brings up is that if your kid is doing something that you're like not super excited about, either it's not an interest that you have, or more likely B, you're adding some sort of value judgment on whether or not it's important. So I just, you know, for me, it's more about like, I just assume that what people are choosing to do when they're allowed to choose to do something. My default assumption is that it's they're choosing to do it because they want to do it, and that in and of itself has value. And then again, when you have the space to be in relationship with kids and really, you know, I'm my authentic self and you're your authentic self, then if I'm noticing a relationship with someone that I care about is struggling with something, or maybe they don't have balance in their life and they want, and like, then you can talk about that stuff, but it doesn't have to be in this way of like, well, I'm gonna create balance in your life for you, but just in a way of like you would support any other friend. So it comes down to respect and trust, and just in the same way you wouldn't question, like it's really like this adultism. Like as an adult, I can go do my job, whatever, and come home. And if I want to watch Netflix for 4 hours and have a few drinks and pass out and do that every night for a month, like, nobody's telling me I can't do. Like that's my responsibility, my choice. And hopefully if I have some good friends, they, get me out of the house and they suggest other things to do. And I have a community to like mix things up and expose myself to other things. But like that's, as adults, we act like kids have to be taught out of those things, but we struggle with those things as adults ourselves. And the way you'd want support isn't someone saying, looking over your shoulder all the time and telling you, now, well, you only have 30 minutes of screen time tonight, and after you take go for a walk, then you can watch your show,
Before we go on, let's listen to this message. Changing a paradigm takes some study, but like me, you are probably super busy. That's why we've teamed up with Audible. Go to our website, thelumousmind.net, get a free month of Audible with 2 audiobooks, thousands of titles, in exchange for only books that you absolutely love. You too can be learning on the go to keep that fire burning. Welcome back to The Luminous Mind with Tomis Parker, using self-directed education to trust children for social change. I'm horrible at this because I was just telling my son that he's got too much screen time going on. But anyway, but it does kind of breed an arrogance. Do you know what I mean? Like we think that we're all perfect, and kids see our flaws, and maybe that's why they stop listening to us, because they're like,
exactly. Right.
You spend 4 hours on Facebook. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, let's talk about your learning centers and maybe what they look like and how they operate. I'm really interested in even the principles that you have, the agile branches and the tree.
Yeah. What do you want to know about them?
Well, kind of maybe where the concept came from, how you feel like they've worked. I mean, when we talk about principles are obviously, true principles, true things that help propel something forward. How have you seen that help with the school?
Well, with the model in general, I mean, so this is one of the things that was really, with the kind of a few people that were initially crafting this concept, that was really important to us, was that there's this tendency with lots of things, but it happens in education where, someone has a bunch of philosophical ideas and writes them down and starts a school or something, and then it gets copied and copied and copied, and basically just trying to be replicated over and over again for decades. And then, there's really no environmental sensitivity to what needs changed over the years based on what's actually happening. And so this is a huge, agile concept in general, is like, we really wanted to have a model that was intended to evolve and change over time, and that having that kind of emergence built into its DNA was essential for its continued relevance. So that's a huge theme for us. But so we kind of wound up finding this metaphor of a tree, because there needs to be something coherent about the model that, that kind of maintains it, so it doesn't just become any old thing that loses, coherence. So that's where the roots are kind of the grounding foundational pillars that kind of root the whole thing, pun intended. And then the branches, or the principles, are kind of known as the branches because they kind of give structure to the organism, like they're living and they're part of what's growing, but they kind of create this structure and the stability for for the thing to flower into fruit and to blossom. So that's kind of the idea with it. And then, continuing it on the leaves or the whatever blossoms on the tree are these tools and practices that we use. And those are the things that are constantly evolving. And the metaphor really holds up nicely here because it seems like every year the tools and practices we use do have some sort of significant evolution. And that's been the case for the 3 or 4 years that we've been playing with this. So that's the general overview. I don't know if you wanted me to be like citing the roots or the principles or what parts you might want to discuss.
I mean, if you want to, I love the idea. I mean, I think it goes back to what we were saying about kids in general. I mean, it's definitely your school has to change to fit their needs, correct? And I mean, like a tree, it's going to go and bend as it's growing to fit the area that it's in. And that's what, I mean, you have just like the basic trunk of the tree, and then you have some, like you said, some of those branches. Do you want to maybe name a few of those and how that works with your learning center?
Yeah, well, there's currently 12 of them. Those, what we did was the second ALF summer program we have, which is called acronym for Agile Learning Facilitator, like this kind of intensive, like co-creative training thing that we invented to kind of get this thing going. During the second year, we did this exercise to try to pull together, to try to articulate what would be the principles or the next phase of this tree metaphor. And so these are just kind of like ideas that help structure, guide you in structuring the community. The first one is infinite play, which is really kind of like this idea of reminding us that life is play and that the idea isn't to win, but to keep the game going. It's kind of inspired by a book by James P. Cars called Finite and Infinite Games. And so that kind of comes from that concept. Let's, expand and contract the game for our benefit, change the rules for our benefit, change the boundaries for our benefit. Like we're the infinite players. The second one is about being agile. So making sure that our tools and practices are flexible and adaptable and easy to change and use however they fit us, and make subtle changes over time. But this is just the idea of like, people over process, that our tools are supposed to serve us, not the other way around. And always going to be checking in with that.
Well, and that's where we make the mistake kind of as parents, like we were talking about earlier, is that sometimes we want the tools to be, telling the child what to do once again. So.
Right. And that's another huge thing with us, is because we have some really, really great tools. And so it's when kind of sharing ALC with people, it's really important to impress that like the model is not using a Kanban board or a community mastery board or whatever. That's a tool for facilitating the roots,
Yeah. I love amplifying agency too, because that's one thing I think, that's where the struggle comes in when people use their agency. Sometimes when they have that freedom and that choice, they don't necessarily make the best choices, but it's also a learning tool, like we talked about before, that struggle, right?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think that principle, speaking more just to the idea of like making sure that individuals are, have the choice and freedom and responsibility for their actions in the context of how the community works and how things are implemented. But yeah, absolutely. And in terms of the overall arc of trusting kids, and that's the kind of thing, seeing conflict as an opportunity, seeing quote bad choices as an opportunity. I mean, this is kind of like fundamental to these ideas. But I mean, Alfie Kohn writes about this in even kind of a progressive education context, but like, kids, I don't know, there's quotes and memes about high schoolers, you're supposed to decide how to spend the rest of their life, and a month before they had to ask to go to the bathroom or whatever. So you expand that idea out even farther with more substance behind it. It's like, what's so fatally, like, we're all going to make mistakes in our lives forever. That's actually how you grow. So that's a catalyst for growth. And how do we actually want to play with that? How do we want to approach that? What tools do we want to, and practices do we want to have in our lives to make sure we're seeing that as growth? And how do we approach that as parents and facilitators in these spaces as well, so that it's not about making sure everyone's doing awesome all the time or feeling great all the time, Certainly you want that to be the norm, but that like, how do you support people when they are going through things?
Yeah, I think a lot of these principles, and I really recommend getting on the AgileLearningCenter.org's website, because they are just interesting, just of how you can even facilitate this in your own house. But one of the things that I thought was neat, I mean, a lot of them deal with the culture and the relationships and, the feedback and the facilities, respecting other people's time. And when you think of like the school where everyone's willing to or running around or whatever, maybe it seems a little chaotic, but you make it sound like there's a lot more structure to it than what we normally think. And how do you keep, one of the last values that they have is the safe space making. I mean, how do you keep that safe where kids feel safe? Because, I mean, we all get that. Like if a kid's being bullied at school, he's not going to feel like he can open up and be his, his authentic self, because that, I mean, how do you keep that safe? How do you keep the critical boundaries and foster that freedom at the same time?
A couple things. I think one thing I would note is that it takes time. The way, an Agile Learning Center will look in its first year is very, very different than the way it will look in its second year, and very, very different than the way it will look in its third or fourth year. And that's because like it takes time when structure and boundaries and safe space making and all that kind of the kind of structure and flow of the community has to come about through everyone's like consensual participation and collaboration with each other. The only way to get there is by building relationships and trust with each other. So there's no shortcut to that. And that's, I think, the biggest thing. But so knowing that right off the bat is really important. One kind of practical thing for us is, this is a lesson that I really learned in working with the free school before ALC, was like, in that absence, that vacuum I was saying can be created when you take away all this kind of predictable structure and authoritarian structure. You have to intentionally fill it with something else. And so with ALC, we have like, it's not that this automatically changes everything, but it sets a different tone. We have a student agreement that we ask all students to sign, and we've started doing it as kind of a community of action at the beginning of the year, like reviewing it, adding to anything we want to add to it, and then signing it together. But we kind of set out like some basic parameters when we start, and saying to kids like, this is an intentional learning community, and we're here to support each other. And so there's very basic tenets to like what you're buying into. None of it has to do with like you're buying into doing math lessons or that kind of stuff, but like you're buying into being taking responsibility for yourself and the community, for treating others with respect, for honoring the agreements that we create together, for what very little things like that. And there's like 4 or 5 bullet points. So that just kind of creates a foundation for this is an intentional learning community, not just the absence of school. So making sure we do visiting weeks when kids come, and it's like, it's about joining something intentional, not just being like, well, school's horrible, or my mom wants me to be here, so I'm here, or whatever. It's about really like the kids wanting to be a part of it. And I think when you start with that from that place, it can be a lot easier. That
definitely changes it. But I mean, do you ever have that happen where the kid doesn't want to be there, but the parents are? I can't imagine not wanting to be here. But
believe it or not, it's happened a couple of times in different contexts. I mean, sometimes the parents are, depending on the community, like the parents are really close friends and connected, and so it's like for a parent, it might have been their community, but their kid really just wanted to be at home or something, and it wasn't the kid's community. So I think, that this doesn't happen a lot, but sometimes that can happen. And that does create, anytime people ultimately don't want to be there, like not just like, oh, I'm having a bad day, but like actually don't want to be a part of this community on a day-to-day basis. There's nothing wrong with that, because we're not going to be the right fit for everyone, and we shouldn't try to be. But whenever that's the case, there's a fundamental thing that you can't really, that's always going to cause some problems, because there isn't like, you're not equally stepping up and collaborating together.
Yeah. Let's kind of talk about, kind of bring it back into, you said at the beginning that you saw this as a great way to make social change. You started a number of these, you've been involved in a lot. What is your kind of your long-term goals of what you think, you're wanting out of working with these schools? I mean, what kind of social change are you hoping to change to?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, For myself, as I get older and I spend more time focusing on building the community that I'm actually in physically, and developing that and how that like really fully encompasses my life. Like there isn't a separate, like the parents at the school are my friends, and the people in our community here are like my social life and work life are the same thing essentially. And the more prominent that becomes in my life, the more I feel the social change, like personally, is like the more it's like real for me. And then at the same time, I also like paralleled with that, I realized that people have to be choosing this for themselves for it to be creating social change. And I've learned that, I've like done my own thought experiments. Like if I was Secretary of Education, blah, 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 there's, it's so much of it's about the consciousness that people have in terms of, we're using the paradigm word again, like where they're living from, their perspective, what they want. And there's so many factors that are influencing that for people. So I guess there's the social change, like in my life, in my community, that's affecting, maybe
the
60 to 100 people directly. And then how that has like a ripple effect.
Yeah, definitely.
But I think the biggest thing is like just doing it and then sharing what you're doing with people that are interested, and just continuing to demonstrate for folks and share the message that like it's possible for you. It's possible for like you can actually take control of your life and have the life you want, and just kind of like making that known that exists for people,
Well, and at the beginning, you kind of talked about, how we're trying to morph these kids into, different shapes of what we think they need to be. And as adults, we see a lot of really miserable adults that have been morphed into those shapes and are not feeling, they're not really truly happy. They're not authentic of who they, like we talked about before, they're not being their authentic self. And I think sometimes when we give this option to people, it's scary, but yet it's just very exciting and freeing. I mean, that's kind of what it's doing to my mind, is that I'm super excited about it. And then, thinking about how that works sometimes, that is sometimes scary because you're not fit in a box anymore, and you kind of become used to that box. But maybe give us an idea, just to kind of close up a little bit, maybe some parting advice that you might have to just helping parents kind of work towards maybe trusting their own kids, how can we do that? I think I had a question down, how do you help parents motivate their kids? But I mean, those are almost opposite ends of the discussion in our discussion, correct?
Well, yeah, I think that in some way it's easy to see those as being like conflicting, but I think that if you focus on the former in terms of trusting kids, then you don't have to actually worry about motivating them. But I don't know. This is a conversation like I always feel a little bit like a punk having when I've been having it for since I was 22 and didn't have kids then and don't have kids now. So I don't have that personal experience as a parent to draw from, but I obviously
but
work.
You work with a lot of kids and see things from a different perspective.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess every situation is probably going to have a slightly nuanced, like more helpful advice based on that context. But in general, just like trying to not forget and remember what it was like being a kid yourself. And like, I think every kid had some, like even kids that tended to be more compliant and appreciate structure being created for them had experiences of just wanting to be taken seriously, wanted to have the freedom to do certain things that they didn't, or whatever. And I think just trying to remember that these kids are just 15 years, 20 years, 30 years. They're just just a little bit, just a slight notch behind on the evolutionary arc of time, So like we have this idea that like, well, once we've turned 18, 21, 25, gotten a certain job or had kids, that like now all of a sudden we've become experts on the world. And like, I've seen people I went to high school with who certainly wouldn't like go to for major life advice or like anything like that, become parents just years after being in high school. And it's like, we're like, just be honest about your infallibility. Like I think being humble as an individual yourself can help you have see your kids in a way that like you're not trying to get them to be all the things that you're not able to be,
Yeah.
So
yeah, you can, not to live through your children, live the life, live your life again through your kids.
Look in the mirror first,
Yeah, I really do think that has a lot to do with it because, like I said, in our society, we've just been brought up with this authoritarian thing, and we have to look infallible to each other and to our children. And a lot of times, that leads to some unhappiness because you're trying to live this fake life that you're not really who you are. But that humbleness to admit that you have mistakes and that you're willing to walk with somebody that has mistakes, I think that can be very freeing to a kid. That's great advice.
Yeah, it should be freeing to a parent too. It's exhausting to like put that facade on all the time. And like, I think that's why so many parents can be stressed out all the time is like, you're trying to, in order to keep that, like keep up the conditions in which you're like, you can kind of control and, manipulate gently or not gently your kids as the authority, like that it's correlates with how well you are putting on that you've got it together. So it's like, it's just a whole other different way of perspecting it, right? Like we're going on this life journey together. I'm here to make sure you like are safe and feel safe and have your basic needs taken care of, and to love you and support you. Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, much different. So is there anything maybe you didn't feel like that we covered that you wanted to talk about? And then give our listeners their contact information of where they can find, more about your learning center or about how to create a self-directed learning environment.
Yeah, I guess we'll just kind of to tie both those up together briefly. We talked a little bit about Agile Learning Centers, and that's kind of like the flavor of self-directed education that I've been fortunate to be able to work on for the past 3 or 4 years, and really strongly believe in, and has a lot of ideas involved that are important to me. There's many others that are really, really valuable, and there's lots of different ways to practice self-directed education. And so for that reason and others, I have been also really excited and fortunate to be working with Peter Gray, who you've had on the show, and Akilah Richards and Scott Noel and a bunch of other amazing people on this project called the Alliance for Self-Directed Education. And that's really just about kind of bringing all these different flavors together into a coherent movement to show that like this is happening in lots of different ways. There's lots of ways to choose it. It's not just unschooling. It's not just democratic schools. There's lots of different things. And to kind of brand this idea of self-directed education and bring these people together to help normalize it in the world. So we're check out selfdirected.org as well as agilelearningcenters.org, and we'll be launching our membership into the Alliance in the next couple of months. That's going to be an awesome way for people to get on and kind of say, hey, I'm doing this, or I want to be doing this, and I want to like kind of fly that flag and connect with other people in my local community and around the world that are doing it, and collaborate and discuss the nuances of it and start organizing, together. So
yeah, changing that idea of what's out there. I love the idea of normalizing it because that's and even creating the community around it, because I think that's where we feel, a lot of times we, as a parent, something's wrong, but you don't know how to fix it. And you feel like you're the only one that feels this way. And then, so bringing people together, making a community is so valuable. So again, Tomis's website for Agile, it's agilelearningcenter.org. That's for the school that he is working at.
AgileLearningCenters.org is site. Yeah. And then you can find a handful of the ALCs from there.
Okay. And then there's selfdirected.org that he mentioned before that is a great resource just to go on to get an idea of what this style of education looks like. But we're going to be sure to link all that information that we've discussed today, even some of the books and stuff that we've mentioned on our website as well. But thank you so much, Tomis, for coming on and joining us and helping light our minds on fire. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Rebecca. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. To learn more about Tomis Parker, go to our show notes at theluminousmind.net. Be sure to become a subscriber to our free email list, then check out our services tab to see how we can continue to assist you, our fire starters. Also, to help continue production of illuminating content, go to the sponsor tab at theluminousmind.net for more information on sponsorship and affiliate programs. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, Google+, Pinterest, and now Instagram. Get our free audio content by subscribing on YouTube, iTunes, and Stitcher. To help us grow, consider these easy ways. Tell your friends about us, leave us a review, share our content, tell us how we can help you so together we can continue to light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education.